Suddenly looking a little concerned. She serves down the centre with an ace, and that's an excellent response.
The serve is really, she's just getting a little shaky now. When things go just almost so well, it's really only got one way to go is down, but her serve is keeping her in this.
Good serve down the centre this time, high backhand return, sits up for Robson, and she waited and then powered away the forehand. That was well executed. 30-15.
She gets that first serve in, it really sets her up so well for the rest of the point. Kirilenko playing so far behind, playing catch up for the rest of the point.
So 30-15. Robson ready to serve once again. And that's long.
Welcome.
Around about a foot,
I'll
something
take
like
care
that.
of
She was
your
aiming
car.
at the right-hander's backhand
Boarding
side.
is right here.
Going
Enjoy your stay.
across the court there. And now the second serve is good. Forehand return from Kirilenko. Winds up for a forehand cross-court low over the net. Now she drives the backhand. And this is good hitting from Kirilenko until she nets with the backhand. And Robson clenching her fist there. She knew that was a big point. Very important. And she won it.
Take your
She's got
place.
game points
We
for
will
a
be taking
5-3
off.
lead. 14-15.
Kirilenko's having to pick up the pace here in the rallies, you know, so she doesn't get in and do a running situation side to side. Robson hitting the winner, so she's picked the pace up, but she's now just forcing a few errors.
40-15. Robson not happy with the ball toss once more. Just tosses it up and then catches it back in the left hand, rather right hand, being the left-handed player. And the serve goes long, so she'll rely on the second serve once again as she seeks to close out this game for a 5-3 lead. Serves, backhand return from Kirilenko, forehand from Robson, lifted over the net, taking the pace off it, even more pace taken off it by Kirilenko with a looper on the backhand. Then she drives the forehand as the Russian. The Russian is there once again with the forehand down the line, and it forces the error from Robson. It just didn't move as easily into that, and netted the forehand.
That was there for the taking, without a doubt. There was plenty of time on balance, just clipping the net down the line, and that's the shot that has been so spectacular for Laura Robson today. So many winners.
You were saying earlier on, so she was sort of playing a brand of tennis reminiscent to Serena Williams. It's now.
Pleased to meet you. Please come this way. Welcome! What a pleasure to have you with us today. Goodbye.
And now she's one game away from her second appearance in the second round at Wimbledon against the 10th seed here. So this would be a real upset in the context of the draw. You don't have to have British bias to sort of start saying that this is notable. This would be the 10th seed going out. And Maria Kirilenko is serving to stay in Wimbledon with the crowds right behind the British number one. Laura Robson is down there at the far end, crouching down, ready to receive serve. 5-3 up in the second set, and won the first set 6 games to 3.
Hello. Yes, of course. One moment, please.
Because it was long. The serve. Looks like there's an elastic band almost.
Everything is fine. I'll give you these immediately.
Place for Maria Kirilenko.
So it is a band, actually. It's tendon.
Here you go.
Kirilenko backhand, powered by
So much that rested on those lovely shoulders. Because she should be in subjection to man.
Since I am Queen of the Scots, God's true anointing.
And she must be in humility.
Launch and break Walker's epic chronicle of the Stuarts. Is heard with a voice on Saturday afternoon at 2:30 on BBC Radio 4. We'll now be joining Harriet Gilbert for
no
a
luck
good
this
read.
time.
Hello, welcome. Today, romance, adventure and cross-dressing in 18th century France, guilt and betrayal in post-war Japan, and tiger others who aren't quite as good at arithmetic as they think. With me to introduce their choice of a good read are first the stand-up comic and writer Bob Mills, star of such TV shows as In Bed with Medina and Win, Lose or Draw, and the scriptwriter for, among others, the movie Pierpoint. Bob's also a regular on Radio 5's somewhat anarchically competitive sports quiz, Fighting Talk. And it so happens that my other guest is the presenter, or perhaps that should be refereed, of Fighting Talk, Colin Murray. A three-time Sony Gold winner, Colin's other broadcasting work includes anchoring the BBC's Match of the Day 2, and earlier this year on radio, presenting Soundscape, a six-part audio journey through music, film and comedy. Colin's also the author of A Random History of Football. Hello. Hello, Colin. Your good read and what's the name?
It's Richard Brodigan in Watermelon Sugar. The personal story behind this book, you know when you're in a new relationship and you start talking about your favourite album, your favourite book, your favourite film. So this was a girlfriend's favourite book. This was her calling card, an insight into her mind. So to explain how much I love this book, I'm married to that woman now, so it was a good choice. I think I'll have the hardest job to then describing the book. There are many theories about a lot of Brodigan's books, but in particular this one, that it's some sort of symbol of like a post-apocalyptic world, and you know, I-Death, where it's set, is actually Eden, and the two main characters are Adam and Eve. I don't see that at all. He's a man who lived in communes. He came out in 1968, and if there's anything post-apocalyptical about it, it would be that they live off the land in this book, and they use everything around it to create everything. Summing the book up itself, it's this delicious balance between fantasy and romance, the beautiful personal lines, and that's why I like it. When I read this book, it did for me as an adult what, say, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory did when I was a child. It puts me in just a beautiful place, and I can picture everything in it, and it's a wonderful place I want to visit one day, but it doesn't exist.
And of course there is a story in there. It's not just a description of this place. I mean, there's a rebel, there's a fallen angel within this community who tries to destroy it at one point. It's got sort of epic qualities, actually, even though it's a very silly book.
There's two places. The Forgotten Works is where Inboyle lives, and Inboyle is this treacherous creature who also seems to have an army of tigers at his disposal. Whether they're actually tigers or not, I've never saw them as tigers. I saw them more as an army of similar cynics rather than literal tigers, hence the fact they can do arithmetic.
Bob Mills, what did you make of the book?
When this plopped on in my letterbox, I have to admit, I thought, oh no. Because I read this, when I came to London in the early 70s and lived in a squat, and we used to read, I would certainly have read this. We read Trap Fishing in America, which is Brodigan's other one, and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and Carlos Castaneda, and we used to sit around late into the night. And one of the things I do remember from this book was the thing, if anyone from outside our group would say to them, what's your name? They would say, what's my name? Yeah, you ever woken in the early hours of the morning and you don't know why, but somewhere in the distance there was a noise? That's my name. And we were horrible, pompous loonies, absolute loonies. And then I got older and I looked back on all these things and I thought, what ridiculous, pompous poppycock those books are. And now I'm in my mid to late 50s and Colin Murray drops this on, and I read it again, and of course I think, no, it's not pompous poppycock. It's not a deep book that if you read over and over again it's going to change your life and show you, but it is beautiful prose. It's absolutely beautiful prose. I understand it exactly as I did when I first read it, which is not at all. I don't know where they are or what's happening to them. I know that it's all slightly outside my own field, but it doesn't matter. It's like one of those films that you watch and you think, I didn't understand that, but wasn't it beautiful?
There's a chapter that sums up exactly what you're just saying, and I'm going to read the entire chapter because it's 2 lines. And I think it's one of the most beautiful lines I've ever read in my life. We walk back to I-Death holding hands. Hands are very nice things, especially after they have travelled back from making love. The whole chapter is he knew it was that good a line.
The problem was, there was a time when people used to try and make sense of these things, and you'd have these incredible arguments with people and say, no, if we just lived our lives, and then, you know, you moved on, and you thought they were all ridiculous. But now you sit back and you read it and you think, it is slightly ridiculous, but you know what, it might be better than what's actually happened when they moved out of their communes. And
Except, do you think, well, ask you, because it's your choice of book, Colin, do you think this commune is supposed to be heavenly? See, because I found myself sympathising with the rebel in Boyle, who clearly thinks something's gone wrong here, that maybe they're all a bit complacent, and there is a sense of it being this really kind of passive, hippy-dippy place. I mean, our narrator is supposedly trying to write a book. There aren't any books, or there are very few books in this place, whatever it is. He's never going to get it written, that's entirely clear. And I wasn't sure, and maybe there is no answer to this, but I wasn't sure whether we were supposed to think, yes, actually, in Boyle is a kind of hero who doesn't necessarily win, or whether we were supposed to see him as the villain that the narrator clearly sees him as.
I can totally see that, because is he a renegade who refused to accept this fake happiness, or is he the cynic? Is he the person that doesn't see beauty in anything and is looking to stop people from, I suppose, very much a commune opinion of sort of everything around it? We can live off everything we have, we don't need anything else. And this is a guy who wanted possessions, you know, who wanted to thrive on other people's unhappiness.
Does it matter that the novel leaves you kind of up to you to make your choice, actually, of what he is?
No, I love that. How good a recommendation is that? You can read this book and your hero can be your villain, or your villain can be your hero. And you'll probably come out of it saying roughly what Bob's just said. Actually, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense. There's just some beautiful language in it.
I think one of the ways it doesn't make sense is precisely because of the language, because although it doesn't really use obscure words, it doesn't have really long, convoluted sentences, but it does something odd with the, I don't know, with the syntax or the grammar, so that you start off thinking you know what the sentence is saying, and then halfway through you think, no, okay, it's things changing shape. I mean, this title, In Watermelon Sugar, it just seems to mean a whole load of things. Quite logically and literally, they make things in this commune out of watermelon sugar. They make their windows and, in fact, almost anything out of it. But it also seems to be a kind of state of mind, you know, like you might say, I've reached nirvana, I've reached watermelon sugar. I mean, it is very weird in that respect.
It's pretty impossible to sum the book up. So I'm going to read you a bit. So in I Death, this is how we do it. Seeds gathered from a grey watermelon picked on a grey day and then planted on a grey day will make more grey watermelons. It's really very simple. The colours of the day and the watermelons go like this. He then lists them from Monday, red watermelons, to Wednesday, the grey watermelons, but on Thursday, black, soundless watermelons. And he says that I like best that day, the black, soundless watermelon days. When you cut into them, they make no noise and taste very sweet. They're very good for making things that have no sound. I remember there was a man who used to make clocks from the black, soundless watermelons, and his clocks were silent. Parts of the book you really have to suspend your belief, and other parts are just really personal.
The first book I ever reviewed was another novel by Waterman. It was Trout Fishing in America, and this was way, way back, late 1970s, something like that. Then he kind of dropped off my radar. I thought at the time, oh, this guy is seriously weird and interesting. But then I didn't hear anything more about him. Well, now I discover, because you've chosen this book, that in fact he's been a cult writer all this time, but particularly among musicians. There was a Jarvis Cocker did his documentary on Radio 4 recently, last year I think, about it. But there's rock bands that have called themselves In Watermelon Sugar or Trout Fishing in America or referenced the novels. What is it with musicians and Waterman?
The language, the words, the flow. If I saw an album called In Watermelon Sugar, I would probably buy it, because I think that sounds like, I like the way that flows. That I can hear the music behind In Watermelon Sugar. Do you know what I mean? You can hear the beat. It's very poetic. So musicians would have adored it.
When you read interviews with great rock and roll stars, you often read your interviews and go, I've no idea what you're talking about, man. I kind of like it.
We've been talking about In Watermelon Sugar by Richard Broughton, and you're listening to A Good Read, where my guests today are Colin Murray and Bob Mills. Bob, what have you chosen?
Okay, I've chosen Georgette Hare, who is a very controversial author. You love her, you hate her, I love her, and it's These Old Shades. For no other reason than this program's called A Good Read, and Georgette Hare is the best read. I discovered Hare, I was just in a bookshop, and I was looking through, and I remembered I'd heard on the radio someone talking about Georgette Hare and saying, honestly, don't be fooled by the covers, it's not what it seems. give it a go. So I gave it a go.
Probably someone on a good read, because she, I have to say, since I've been presenting this programme, she is the only author who's been picked 3 times.
Well, there you go.
Other 2 by old women.
Well, there is something in that.
These Old Shades is the story of Satanas. He's His Grace of Avon, Duke of Avon, and he's a hard man. He's walking through Paris. A little boy runs into him, and for various reasons he adopts him and he becomes his page. And then we discover that in fact it's not a boy, it's a young girl. And we realise that the reason he adopted her is because he saw in her a likeness to this old enemy of his. And it's a long drawn-out story of French families swapping children at birth so that they could inherit. None of that really matters. The beauty of Hair is that once you start reading them, you have to just let go of all your preconceptions about blue rinses and bodice busters and all that nonsense. And bingo. Let them go and just let yourself be transported into this wonderful world that she creates. Some people can't do that, and my sympathies are with them.
Colin, you're wrong that it's only old women who like these books, but you are right, I should say, that it is predominantly women of all ages who like Georgette Hare.
I think more than that, I'm right to wind up Bob Mills. Which is inaccurate, you're exactly right. This book describes characters with effortless brilliance. It can put a character in your mind in 2 paragraphs. You know, it's interesting because I then read a bit about her to see how she manages to do that, and her first book was written for her young brother who was ill. Yeah. She wasn't writing as an author as such. The first page of this book, I won't read it, but you get to the end of page 1, and the main character, His Grace of Avon, you know, he's there in all his glorious technicolor. You know how he walks down this street, he's swishing the cane about, and this is what he's wearing, this pompous, slightly over the top, extrovert, upper class. So straight away, all the characters I loved. What I found really interesting about it was maybe it's a sign of how many storylines there are today, because this book is, 90 years old? These days, we're so used to a plot having 6 or 7 twists, that as I was going through this book, I was so sure that, I'm not giving anything away here, but I was so sure in the opening scene, when Leon runs down and bangs in to His Grace of Avon, that he was planted there by the Count of Saint-Vier, and it was all from the start an elaborate plot for him to get his own back on the Duke of Avon. Okay. So I ended up turning myself into knots where actually it's not that at all. It's a very easy, enjoyable read, and I love a book where you root for the villain, and that is so hard to do. And when you genuinely, with all his flaws and all his nastiness, you root for the guy who's actually bad.
I should say that this novel's set a bit earlier than the novels for which Georgette Hare's famous, the Regency romances. This is set in the middle of the 18th century, the court of Louis XV. I'm still curious. I'm delighted, since I'm a total convert to Georgette Hare, that you 2 guys like the book.
Yeah, John.
I mean, I'm really, really pleased, but I'm still puzzled, because although I can see that there are loads of things which you can enjoy regardless of sex, I mean, she just writes beautifully structured novels. They're beautifully paced. There's never a moment when you sort of think, oh, come on. And I think she's very funny with some very witty dialogue.
Yeah.
There's one point when young Leon is telling, when I think she's still a boy at this point, is telling the Duke about her family, and she says, you know, that my parents died recently. Did they die simultaneously? Wonderful. This question. But for me, I'd say there were a lot of things that were specifically, if not designed to appeal to women, but that just would specifically. For instance, there's a really heart-rending scene when Leon is being forced to change into women's clothes, and I think any woman who's ever been a tomboy will totally identify with that, and most women were at one point. I mean, it's actually quite anguishing, that moment. There's also the good old romance of the much older man, because, I mean, you called her a girl, Bob, but I mean, she is, we should say, firmly 19. But nonetheless, he is 40. But he's a much older man, he's a kind of father figure, he's much more powerful than her, he's physically strong, he's wealthy, he's a duke, for goodness sake. And for me, there is the enormous eroticism of all the cross-dressing. I mean, and she's You know, half the time she's his page in this wonderful little black outfit, and she resumes it when she goes off on an adventure. And he is actually pretty well in drag as well. He's wearing satin and silk and more jewellery than you care to think of, and diamonds and emeralds all often. So there's that kind of, for me, erotic tension. I mean, Bob, do you find this?
Yeah, I find the humour is one thing I pick up. Just jump what you said then. You see, I found that really attractive, the age different things, because in fact, he's suffering from that as much, because for all he's Duke of Edinburgh, he can have what he wants and do what he wants and had enormous conquests wherever he goes, and yet he's really frightened that this, because he realises he's fallen in love with her, but he's saying she can't possibly want an old man like me. That's not, and in the end it's her that kind of talks him into it.
Interesting as well. I also read the piece when she's in England and the Duke of Avon's sister is turning her into a woman, and which she describes quite tragic. I felt the opposite, because I actually thought that her brother had physically and mentally abused her, and for maybe a year or two before puberty she'd been made to dress as a boy and was confused, but was very much a woman who'd been made to, a child who'd been made to dress as the opposite sex. So I saw that a little bit as a liberation, that she would flower into what she does.
It was a huge
it's interesting that we've read exactly the same bit from a completely different thought of it. I found that like quite liberating for her, that she'd been allowed to be herself, even though she didn't want it. She didn't have the mental capacity to realise how wrong it was what she'd been subjected to.
The other great thing about hair, I must say,
She'd get it at airports, that's good.
is that you get it at airports and all good railway stations. Also, the great thing about them all is they sit in a shelf in my house with Patrick O'Brien and George MacDonald Fraser. What they have in common is that you read them and you think, what did she mean by that? What was that thing about the Pretender? And who was this person that she talked about in there? And if you go on Google, you find out. And they take you, you can learn an awful lot from these books.
People who haven't read her tend to lump her together with Mills and Boon authors, with Barbara Cartland.
I was hoping no one was going to say Cartland. I'm not a fighting man, but I'll stand up with anyone who says they don't like Cartland.
It's not a toilet book, this, right? And it's not a book for people who don't like to read books, and that's very important. Just because it's an easy read doesn't make it a bad read.
No.
And I think that's what really suits the programme, because it is a good read. It's not a spectacular read. It's not a life-changing read. It's a good read. And you know, it's the type of thing you read and you put it down. And there's a lot of good things to be said about it.
Germaine Greer has argued that it is life-changing, that it deforms the romantic expectations of young girls, that they read it and they... Actually, this is one thing that is perfectly true in this, that one theme is very much that falling in love with Leonce stroke Leonie turns the Duke from being this selfish, cruel man into being a loving, caring man, which is, of course, a dangerous myth for girls to grow up with. Just because some, I'm trying to think of a polite word to say, just because some man who is particularly unpleasant falls in love with them, is not going to necessarily become nice. This kind of romance has been called pornography for women, and I just wonder whether there was a serious argument there that it gave girls unrealistic expectations of love and sex in the same way as young boys looking at porn get totally daft ideas.
I don't know whether it did at the time. I don't know what it was like when girls were reading it when they were written. But I don't think so. I think it's too clever for that. And the women are very powerful in it. Throughout all Hare's thing, you get these young heroines who in Cartland and maybe even in Austin would faint away a little bit, but they never faint away in Hare. They stand up for themselves.
Yeah, there's a point where Leonie is waiting for Rupert, the Duke's brother, to come and rescue her because she's been kidnapped, and she thinks, I'm not going to wait for him to come and rescue me, I'm going to rescue myself.
Exactly.
And does.
Exactly. And also there's the era as well. I don't know whether it's gratuitous in the day, but I'm 36 years old, and one of the notes I made is I like the fact where it could have been very gratuitously sexual, it wasn't. You know, so maybe that's just the era you grew up in. This book was very old-fashioned in that way. It was good, bad, and it all worked towards the end. It was quite swashbuckling that way. And I enjoyed that. It never sort of upset me.
Well, we've been talking about These Old Shades by Georgette Hare. And the book I've chosen as a good read is a novel by Kazuo Ishiguro, who's probably best known recently for Never Let Me Go, about the clone children, and best known of all for The Remains of the Day. But this book comes before that even. It was a novel he wrote in 1986, his second novel. It's called An Artist of the Floating World, and It's set in Japan in the aftermath of World War II. Japan's occupied by the Allies. And we just spend 18 months or so in the company of a one-time artist, an old guy called Masuji Ono. And he's contemplating what's happened to his country, which is this totally shamed, defeated country, and to himself. And the crucial thing is that before the war and leading up to it, he became totally converted to the idea that Japan should be this imperialistic, expansionist military country. And he changed from painting scenes of the floating world, of the nightlife, of the geishas, of the bars and so on, into painting propaganda pictures. And now, post-war, all this is being looked at as something rather shameful. And he's trying to adjust to this. And what's kind of interesting is that as he thinks back to what he did and what he should have done and what he maybe shouldn't have done, we realise, as with the butler Stevens in The Remains of the Day, that he's not at all a reliable narrator of his own life. And that as the novel progresses, we begin to doubt, actually, that his being this propagandist painter was important at all, maybe. The whole time, as the scene in Japan is totally changing and everything's just being whisked from under people's feet, so this novel keeps whisking certainties from under our feet, I think. And I just think it's beautifully done. It feels like a very fine, frail novel, but actually it's just delicate. I think it's very strong. Colin?
Well, you're probably right. And those people who chose it as the Whitbread Book of the Year, they're probably right. And those people who shortlisted it for the Booker Prize, I'm sure they're right. And I'm probably wrong. But I find it one of the most frustrating, underwhelming books I've ever read in my life. So much opportunity to go somewhere, so much opportunity for the story to develop, and instead it was thrown away at every turn. Things that you thought were going to be important were actually just whimsical asides that he would apologise for. And I don't know whether he was trying to write it as someone in their autumn years, as old people do. They will digress for no reason whatsoever, and they will keep explaining the same things to you over and over again. We know you have a table in the bar. You do not have to tell us 4 times. We know exactly what this area looks like. You told me in chapter 2. Why are you telling me again in chapter 6, chapter 7? And I kept thinking this, but it's 180 pages. You're waiting for the last 10 pages to blow your mind. You're going through in your head, what has he done? What has he done during the war? Because it never says. It's okay, we know he was painting these propaganda pictures, but what happened during the war? And he touches on all these characters doing this, that and the other, never on himself. You've got his 2 daughters whispering, and as he enters the room they stop, and he says on 3 or 4 occasions that's happened. And you hear of all these other people who've killed themselves, who've actually committed suicide for doing roughly what he did, to apologise for supporting that regime. And instead he just dotters through the book, and at the end he kind of goes, well, you know what, that's it. There's some beautiful pieces of writing in it. There's one of my favourite descriptions ever. So this is where the telephone wires have all been blown away and cut down. There's no electricity, there's no communication. But he describes the birds all standing around, and you may be able to make out the dark clusters of birds perched uncomfortably on the tops of the poles, as though awaiting the wires along which they once lined the sky. And it's sort of this displaced wildlife also almost wanting to come back, and that was beautiful. And the way he wrote the character of Ishiro, the little kid, was joyous every time Ishiro was in the book. I don't know how he wrote a kid so well. He wrote me as a child. This incredible face against the glass. It was beautiful. It left me so cold. I thought, what a missed opportunity.
Bob, were you as disappointed?
No, not as disappointed. It didn't leave me cold. I enjoyed it, but I did feel it was a frustrating book for those very reasons. One of the things that he did quite early on was he wonderfully describes the scene and then says, although I haven't been thinking about it now, that might not have happened as I said it, because that was the sort of phrase, that phrase that I just used, that was the phrase my teacher used to use, so I might just be remembering something that he says. And that device, you thought, no, that's a good device, because that, you'll take us somewhere with that, and something will come to light. Oh, it wasn't me that said that. And there was a point towards the end when it all got a bit beautiful mindish, and you thought, wow, is this suddenly going to come out that none of this happened, and that he's just torturing himself for one thing that he did, and he doesn't need to be. But then, as Colin said, it didn't. It was
But you see, that's what I so love about this book, that it doesn't have a neat resolution. It doesn't even have a neat moral resolution. I mean, to me, it's centrally a novel about integrity, about moral consistency or constancy. And what's so delightful to me is you think precisely that you're going to learn that this man either did or didn't have integrity. And it's not like that. Actually, he quite clearly did, at some points in his life as an artist, make decisions based on what he thought was artistically correct. And at other times, and this is less sure what's going on after the war, because he lies. I mean, he misleads you. He says, I can't quite remember whether that was how it was. I think it was. But he may have sold himself out innumerable times as well. And the one character in it who appears to have stuck by his guns the whole time is an old fascist, an old friend of his called Matsuda, who's obviously very ill and dying by the time this book happens. And you just don't know, what are you being asked to think here? That actually being constant and having integrity is always a good thing, or is it sometimes not a good thing? I just love the way it's left like that. It causes you to think. It doesn't tell you what any answers are. And it does. I agree, it fades out, it just drifts away from you. And that, by me, is fine. I love it.
You see, I wonder, is it a case that when I'm buying new music, having had my head buried in new music for 15 years, I will look for something different, and I'll look for something original. I'll not necessarily look for the best record. And we can hear a joke and laugh very loud at it, and Bob will say, I heard that joke in 1986. But we don't hear jokes every day, and jokes are not our business, and we don't do stand-up comedy, and we're not comedy writers. And for an author to find a book like this, maybe it's a thing that if books are your life, you get off on it because it's different.
I don't think it's because I deal with books the whole time, because actually I read this back when it came out in the 80s. Well, I suppose I was writing then, yes, you're right. Anyway, we've been talking about An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro, which is published by Faber. And earlier we were talking about Richard Brautigan's In Watermelon Sugar, published by Vintage, and These Old Shades by Georgette Hare, published by Arrow Books. And if you happen to have read any of today's books, do let us know what you think. Join the conversation on Twitter using #AGR. But for now, to my guests, Bob Mills and Colin Murray, thank you both. And to you, till next week, thanks for listening.
A Good Read was presented by Harriet Gilbert and produced in Bristol by Beth O'D. And you can download the programme from the A Good Read page of the Radio 4 website. PM is next, but first, here's Kirsty Young.
My castaway this week is the actor Hugh Laurie.
There were days, particularly when writing with Stephen, when things would just sort of flop out onto the page, just like landing a big gleaming salmon, which, by the way, I've never done, but I imagine would be a very satisfying thing. And the laughter would provoke the next idea and the next idea and the next idea, and all of a sudden you would have something that you knew was a genuinely good and interesting and funny piece of work that you could actually present to the public without shame.
My castaway, Hugh Laurie. Do join us for Desert Island Discs on Friday morning at 9.
This is BBC Radio 4. It's 5 o'clock, time for PM with Carolyn Quinn.
New claims that police bugged meetings between Stephen Lawrence's friend and his lawyer. Dwayne Brooks' solicitor joins us live. Also tonight, as Ian Brady speaks in public for the first time since 1966, we report from the court in Merseyside.
This tribunal is a stage from which he's looked down on the rest of the world, the way he looked down on the world with Myra Hindley. They created, in her words, a world above.
Russia confirms Edward Snowden is still at Moscow airport. We'll talk to a man who's been halfway across the globe trying to track him down. And later, the unlikely scourge of our churches.
Mammals defecate and urinate, and the blunt reality is that bat feces and bat urine have the potential to do and do enormous damage in churches.
We'll hear a defence of bats. Also before 6, find out what did this to Robert Peston.
I like the church. I'm going to go back to broadcasting house now. I notice it.
He's all right. With the BBC News throughout the hour, Charles Carroll.
BBC News has been told that the Metropolitan Police secretly bugged meetings between Stephen Lawrence's friend, Dwayne Brooks, and his lawyer at the solicitor's office. A police source says 2 meetings with officers on the murder investigation team were recorded after a senior officer had given authorization. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Danny Shaw.
Dwayne Brooks, who was with Stephen Lawrence when he was killed and was a prosecution witness at the murder trial, had 2 meetings with his solicitor at her office in North London about 13 years ago. They were briefed by a detective about the progress of the investigation. A senior police source says he's seen documents showing that the meetings were secretly recorded after a senior officer gave his authorization. The manner of the bugging operation and its purpose are unclear, but the revelations will add to pressure on the Met following claims that undercover police officers tried to smear Stephen Lawrence's family.
The Mullers murderer, Ian Brady, has been speaking in public for the first time since he was jailed in 1966 for killing children. He told a mental health tribunal on Merseyside that his crimes were, in his words, recreational killings, comparable to the acts of soldiers and politicians. Tom Esselman reports.
Ian Brady said he was a petty criminal and that after 50 years in what he called captivity, he'd had enough. He described his killings as an existential experience. Brady wants to be moved from the high-security Ashworth Hospital on Merseyside to a normal prison, but medical officials argue that he's a paranoid schizophrenic who needs round-the-clock care. He's thought to have been on hunger strike since 1999, and the authorities believe he'll starve himself to death if he's transferred to a mainstream prison.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin has confirmed that the American whistleblower Edward Snowden is still in the transit area of Moscow airport. Speaking in Finland, Mr. Putin said that Mr. Snowden, who's wanted in the US for leaking security information, was free to leave, and the sooner he did so, the better. A mother has been jailed for life, served at least 18 years in jail for beating to death her 2 weeks. Birmingham Crown Court heard that Rebecca Shuttleworth inflicted horrific injuries on Keanu Williams, who died 2 years ago. Benendo reports.
When he died in January 2011, Keanu Williams had 37 separate injuries. Rebecca Shuttleworth said the judge was manipulative and deceitful and had subjected Keanu to a lingering death after beating him with a broom handle or a pool cue. She was jailed for life and will serve at least 18 years in prison. Her ex-boyfriend, Prince Somerton, was cleared of involvement in Keanu's death and given a suspended sentence for biting him on 1 occasion on Shuttleworth's orders. A serious case review is also underway to ask why various agencies who came into contact with the family failed to protect Keanu, who was, said the judge, a delightful little boy.
A man cleared of raping a pensioner in her home in East London 16 years ago has been found guilty in a second trial. The original hearing was stopped when DNA evidence was ruled inadmissible. Changes in the law meant that Randall Baker could be tried again. The judge says he will consider a life term when sentencing Baker on Friday. Nelson Mandela's relatives have been visiting the former South African president in hospital in Pretoria. He remains in a critical condition, showing recurring lung infection. And astronomers have discovered a group of planets orbiting a part of space which are unknown capable of supporting life. Researchers say it's the first time such an observation's been made. Here's Jonathan Amos.
Planet discoveries beyond our solar system are coming thick and fast.
At the next intersection, turn left. Turn left.
Gilles 677c is likely to have 7 planets, 3 of which may be little
At
bigger
the next
than Earth,
intersection,
orbiting
turn
in
left.
so-called habitable zone. This is the region around the star where temperatures would permit liquid water, a
Turn
prerequisite
left.
for life. Precisely what conditions are like on the moon, no
Turn
one can
right.
say. At a distance of 130 trillion miles, they cannot be studied in detail with current telescopes.
Jonathan Amos reporting. 5:05, more now on those revelations about the behaviour of the police following the murder of Stephen Lawrence in South East London in 1993. Our Home Affairs correspondent Danny Shaw is here and has the details.
Yes, well, what we are learning this afternoon, Cameron, is that it appears that the Metropolitan Police twice bugged or illicitly recorded meetings between Dwayne Brooks, his legal representatives, and senior police officers at his solicitors' offices in North London around about the time of 1999 and 2000. So this was at the time when the McPherson report had just come out, and also when there was renewed impetus with the investigation when Deputy Assistant Commissioner John Green took over. But clearly this is going to be extremely
meetings at a solicitor's office were being recorded by the police, apparently without the consent of Mr. Brooks or his legal representatives, and have been authorised by a senior officer at the Met.
Has the Metropolitan Police responded to this allegation?
We have had a response from the Met Police that it says that the Commissioner's Office has passed the matter to the head of the Directorate of Professional Standards as Assistant Commissioner Fiona Taylor. She has started to look into a meeting and is treating it with huge seriousness. It's only a few hours or so since we drew this to the attention of Scotland Yard, although I think it's possible that documents relating to the authorisation to run these meetings have been lying in Scotland Yard, the Metropolitan Police, for some time. They were uncovered a few years ago, and that's my understanding.
Is there any chance of finding out who did authorise?
Well, we may have the details of that at this stage. Clearly, that is something that we will try and pursue. But I think what's clear is what the purpose of this was. Dwayne Brooks was someone who was assisting the prosecution, as well as the prosecution of the murder trials that took place, the successful murder trial in 2012. But he was also someone who was targeted by the police.
At the next intersection, turn right.
In fact, he was arrested some 6 times in 6 years after Stephen Lawrence's murder. Was put on trial twice, acquitted twice in the direction of the judge. So there was a sort of history between him and the Metropolitan Police. So whether that has got anything to do with it is unclear. But it's hard to see what purpose can be served. I mean, and obviously said to me they wanted to record such a meeting in order to be clear about what had been said and what had not been said. Then they could have asked to record the meeting or even just taken notes of the meeting. Why it was done omissionally suggests that there was something underhand, so they didn't want Dwayne Brooks to find out.
Let's keep more questions. I know, Danny, for the moment, thank you very much. Listening to that, Jim Dyson, who was one of Dwayne Brooks' lawyers during that period, you were present at one of the meetings, weren't you? Did you have any suspicion at all that the meeting might be legal from this one? We had suspicions. We don't yet know what was being recorded. As long as it's differed from the other meetings that we had with police were being recorded. One is there is absolutely no rational reason, and that is very worrying for officers, because it's quite sinister. Why covertly record a meeting that you asked for? You want to give the victim of a crime information about an investigation into it. Why, unless it's part of something much bigger? Why, unless in fact covert recordings were happening of Dwayne Brooks and ourselves in different situations? And that's what we want to know. What was the point of the meeting as far as you were concerned? As far as I remember, the police wanted to brief Dwayne Brooks about the progress they were making into their investigation into the attack on him and Stephen Lawrence. And meetings between lawyers and their clients, of course, are protected by confidentiality rules. But is that the same for a briefing held with police officers present? Well, the irony of this is that the police asked us to keep the details confidential. Because that the police request the details of what they were telling us were to be kept confidential. As Danny mentioned, the undercover police officer that we've been hearing from in recent days, Peter Francis, had already alleged that he was instructed to find information to discredit Dwayne Brooks. This looks like it could be another strand of that, do you think? It does feel that there's been a persistent attempt from 1983 up to 1990 to
Miami. You win.
Against him. But he does need to because it's so many years on. It's a scandal. It's a scandal that any individual should have to go through this. The chance to talk to him today is the and how was he reacted to this? His reaction is that if it's true, it's a scandal. And if it's true, he wants and he needs to know now that it's true. And what else is happened? He doesn't want and can't.
At the next intersection, turn right.
To wait for this information. He wants it now. He wants it all. He wants to be able to come to terms.
Turn right.
Not only with what happened to him, but with how the police have treated him. We're talking about events 20 years ago, aren't we? How were relations between the police and your team and the Lawrence family at that time? How did you regard them as well? In 1999? Well, firstly, established that the way in which the police have treated Ray was racist. And as a result of that inquiry, the police appeared to be making efforts to treat Ray with the dignity and respect that he deserved. Part of that change of conduct was the Deputy Assistant Commissioner asking to meet him in the offices to brief him on what he was doing. So on the face of it, as a result of the incarceration, the police have begun to treat Ray with respect. But if any of this is true, then the face of it is not. As you say, if it's true, there's a clear allegation still to be investigated. Jane, Dieter, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. 13 minutes past 5 now. Charles, how's the headlines?
As we've been hearing, BBC News has been told that the Metropolitan Police secretly recorded conversations between Bruce, the best friend of teenager Stephen Lawrence, and his solicitors. Scotland Yard says the claims are being treated with huge seriousness. A woman described as a monster by police has been jailed for life for murdering her 2-year-old son, and scientists have discovered planets similar to Earth, which they believe have some life.
Keith Bennett's body is still missing outside of Wetherby. One of 5 children tortured and murdered by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. The search for their bodies captured the public imagination 47 years ago.
Police and hundreds of volunteers continue their gruesome search for the bodies of murder victims, working on a scant tipple of equals and the evidence of a baseball. Police and traffic lights have stepped up the search since the body of 10-year-old Ian Brady was found there. She'd been missing 6 days in that year. The Empire and the Royal Society of the Green One have been
Last time Ian Brady was heard of murder was in 1966 at Chester, where he denied the reports he was actually convicted of 3 of them and jailed for them. Today he spoke about for the first time since their lifting the lid on half a century of bonds. The tribunal is trying to determine whether Brady, who was 79, should be moved into the prison system for Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital in Merseyside. He's been giving evidence from there, which is being relayed for a video linked to the Corner of Manchester, where relatives of some of his victims have been watching. Among them, Terry Kilroy, whose brother John was killed by the pair. He was there yesterday. But Brady hasn't offered such relief. Instead, he's been arguing for the right to be moved to a prison so that he can starve himself to death. He claims to have been on hunger strike since 1999, yet when submerged, he makes himself toast for breakfast and cooks soup from packets. Our Home Affairs correspondent Dominic Casciani has been at the tribunal.
Carolyn, Ian Brady sat in this image secure hospital looking utterly average. He had an average suit, a boring blue tie, but
But what marked him out as different was not just the dark.
Your destination is 3 miles away.
See, but the way he launched into a day-long
At the next intersection, turn left.
deciding his future. He spoke with a soft Scottish accent and was initially fairly unemotional, but every word he said was weighed. He would sometimes qualify what he was saying with complex subclauses and references to let everyone know he reads widely. He would sometimes be more direct, for instance, accusing Ashworth of turning patients into zombies through false medicine. What's clear is he's pretty clever and he wants people to know it. He enjoyed intellectual games today. At one point when he claimed that he used method acting to pretend that he was psychotic, he chided the tribunal for not knowing more about the technique that he'd read upon. He also knows an awful lot about what the rest of the world thinks of him. He describes his own crimes as historic because of the way they've been presented in the media. Murders against the backdrop of, as he described it, wuthering heights and hounds of the basketballs. When he was asked why he had killed 5 times, he said it was an existential exercise. He said he showed no remorse. As his own
Your
counsel
destination is 2 miles away.
he never appeared to let up. He gave a long account of being the victim of misdiagnosis by doctors who would take any unorthodox behaviour and label it as mental illness. In prison, he argued he was reciting Shakespeare to himself to keep his mind ticking over. In Ashworth, that
Your
was the
destination is 1.5 miles away.
doesn't talk to himself, he said this morning. But his body language changed as the day went on. He sat further back in his chair, hunching his shoulders, crossing his arms tightly, and occasionally jabbing his finger at the actual TV8. He says the doctors there are robots who have treated him as
Your destination is 1
It's not
mile away.
honest time.